Tales from the Ribble Valley by Cornelius MacManus and George Hull. The Sergeant's Rival. Yonder house with all roses in front on it? Oh, yon, where Inspector Deeby lives. You'll have heard of Inspector Deeby. I confess that such was not the case. My informant, leaning on his crooked stick and looking straight into my face, said it was strange if I had not heard of Inspector Deeby. I might, he said, have forgotten it, but I must have heard of him, as all the newspapers printed the wonderful story of Inspector Deeby. There was a little country public house at hand. It looked to my eye like a big farmhouse, where drink was occasionally sold, rather than a regular public house. The man with the crooked stick said that if I would wait until 8 o'clock at night, I should find people from all parts of Samlesbury there. Not having any special desire to meet so many specimens of the natives of Samlesbury, I did not stop until 8 o'clock. I, however, took him of the crooked stick into the public house, and the refreshment I put into him displaced the following story, for the accuracy of which my informant would vouch if he was dying. As, however, he was not dying, I have only to rely on his assertion that every word of the tale is substantially true. In his early days, Mr. Deeby was a farm labourer. In his 3rd decade, however, he joined the police force. Making use of the knowledge he possessed as to his companions' habits, he secured some very important convictions. He knew the ways of more than one gang of amateur poachers, and his stringent application of the game laws at once secured him the hatred of his neighbours and the favour of the county bench. After a short experience as a common constable, Deeby was made a sergeant. About the time that he took his first step on the ladder of promotion, Deeby followed the lead of ordinary mortals by falling very deeply in love. The object of his affections was a girl named Alice Gray, the daughter of a small farmer who lived at Boulderstone. There is no doubt that his love was returned by the young lady, and there was, to all appearances, every prospect of the affair going on sweetly and smoothly to the desired end. One evening the sergeant was returning from the residence of his sweetheart when he met with a very suspicious-looking fellow. This person was loitering in a dark part of the road in the lonely hollow by Samlesbury Church. The sergeant was in plain clothes, and the traveller came up and demanded to know if he had any money about him. The sergeant replied that he had, and moreover, he was going to keep it. The stranger required a few coppers for a night's lodgings, and when the sergeant declined to supply them, he grew insolent and even threatening in his demeanour. Then the tramp found out for the first time that his intended victim was a policeman, and that he himself was a prisoner. It was a long time since the nearest magistrate had been bothered with a case, and after sleepily pretending to listen to the sergeant's evidence, he remanded the prisoner for a week. In the meantime, enquiries to be made about his character. At the end of the week, the prisoner was brought up at the county police court. Sergeant Deeby laid the complaint against him. He described the encounter with the prisoner. He told how his suspicions had been aroused by the man's appearance, how he had replied to the demand for assistance, and how he had finally been compelled to take the prisoner into custody. Asked if he had any questions to put to the witness, the prisoner addressed himself to Sergeant Deeby. "Do you say I ask you for money?" "I do." "Will you swear it?" "I will." "Tell the bench what words I used when I asked you." "Well, you said you wanted money for lodgings." "That wasn't asking for it." "What else did I say?" "You said you must get it from somebody." "What else?" "Well, I said I wouldn't give it to you, and you wanted to know if I'd wrestle you for a shilling, and such like talk as that." "Did I ask you straight out for money?" "Well, not straight out, but you meant it." "How can you tell what I meant?" demanded the prisoner. Receiving no answer, he addressed himself to the bench. He pointed out the weakness of the constable's evidence. He denied that he had either begged or threatened. He gave a version of the occurrence entirely different from that supplied by the sergeant. He declared that he was simply asking the way, when the officer commenced to abuse him. When he replied to the policeman's taunts, the officer locked him up, and all he could say was that the sergeant was hard up for a case, and that he never had hold of a more innocent man in his life. The superintendent said that nothing had, as yet, been heard of the prisoner's antecedents, but if the magistrates decided to send the prisoner to jail on a charge of vagrancy, something might transpire before he came out again. The bench consisted of 2 magistrates. They conferred in solemn silence for some minutes. Then the chairman announced that they had decided to extend the greatest possible leniency to the prisoner, and with the object of giving him a chance to make a fresh start in life, they would discharge him. The clerk smiled, and the superintendent looked grave. Sergeant Deeby rushed out of court and went through some terrible manoeuvres in an adjacent corridor, and the public in court agreed amongst themselves that justice was still blind. It certainly appeared to the sergeant that his ambition had received a check. The flowery prospects pictured by his fancy were falling victims to the frosts of official callousness. But Sergeant Deeby went on with his courting all the same. The magistrates couldn't stop that, and the sergeant was certain that nobody else could. The sun always shone in one place, and 1 hour of its rays dispelled all the snows that chilled the sergeant's everyday life. A few days after the prisoner had been set free, there came a telegram from Lincoln stating that he was an ex-convict and was wanted there on 3 charges of housebreaking. Sergeant Deeby felt that that was his revenge. Farming in the Ribble Valley is not the easiest way of becoming a millionaire. Mr. Gray had long since found that it was not. He was one Saturday evening reading the Preston Guardian to gather as many hints concerning farming as he could. When he had exhausted the agricultural news, he returned to the items of local news. From this to the advertisements was but a step. He read over the lists of farms to be let, and wondered that there weren't more of them. At length his eye alighted on an advert stating the requirements of a gentleman who wanted country lodgings for the summer. He invited replies from farmers and simply stated that the terms were to be moderate. Mr. Gray thought that a few shillings a week would be a very nice addition to his somewhat limited income. He replied to the advertisement of F.W. He stated as low terms as he could afford, and in a fortnight Mr. Francis Hardwin was installed as a temporary inmate of Mr. Gray's home. Mr. Hardwin was a London gentleman who wanted country air. His health was not so good. Mr. Gray thought it must be very bad to cause him to leave London and come to a place like Balderstone, but Mr. Gray had never lived out of Balderstone and was discontented with its dullness. When Sergeant Deeby came again, he was introduced to Mr. Hardwin. He afterwards confided to Alice that he didn't like the newcomer. This was not at all likely. The sergeant had always posed as an oracle wherever he went. He was an authority on all subjects, from the habits of moles to the policy of empires, and hitherto there had been none to contradict him. At their first interview, however, Mr. Hardwin ventured to correct the sergeant several times. The points were unimportant, but the officer's reputation was at stake. He burned with just indignation at the stranger's uncalled-for interference, and privately told Alice what a pleasure it would have been to give the newcomer a good licking. Alice sympathised with her lover, of course, but when she found that as time went on the sergeant's dislike of her father's lodger grew more violent, she felt herself justified in questioning the necessity of his objection. "Well, I don't like him," said the sergeant. "He's a very nice man," said Alice. "Maybe you think so, but he's all talk. It's all he has to do, and he's been in so many places where we haven't. My father likes to hear his tales." "Then your father's got a different taste from mine." "Perhaps so, but I can't see anything wrong with the man." No, I dare say you like to flirt with him. I never flirt with anybody, but I can't dislike the man without cause. He has been very nice to me. Yes, I understand his smirking and his smiles, and you'll understand them to your sorrow some day if you don't beware. I think I am capable of looking after myself. If you think that his smiles would have any effect on me, you are mistaken. There was a show of temper on both sides. While the sergeant wanted his own way, Alice didn't like to be dictated to. To tell the truth, she didn't altogether object to the attentions which the stranger had undoubtedly paid to her. She thought that a little rivalry would rid the sergeant of his supercilious airs, and she didn't mind his knowing that he was not the only Richmond in the field. "So," said the sergeant when they met one Sunday evening, "you've been seen walking out with that London chap. I walked down to church with him this morning. I'd rather you wouldn't walk out with him at all, and I would rather please myself about it. I think I ought to have a say in the matter." "I don't think so. I'm not tied to you yet, and you never will be if you flirt too much with the lodger." "Well, I can please myself. If you don't like it, you can say so. I don't feel particularly anxious to bind myself to anybody yet." "You'll repent those words before long," said the sergeant. But Alice only tossed her head, and with one of those smiles which Mr. Hardwin had told her was so enchanting, she bade the sergeant a hearty good evening. There is no doubt that she was affected, if not entranced, by the polished mien of Mr. Hardwin. He had addressed her in a manner more polite than she was accustomed to. He had gratified her ears with lavish praises of her personal beauty, and he had even gone so far as to advise her never to throw herself away upon a rustic hind or a country-bred lamb. For some time the sergeant did not meet his sweetheart. He was waiting for her to come to his way of thinking. Alice was waiting for the officer to soften his views towards Mr. Hardwin. So it will be seen that instead of coming nearer to each other, they were in reality drifting apart, and before long it seemed as if their engagement was at an end. Alice was seen out more than once with Mr. Hardwin. He had met her in odd corners and turns of the lanes when she was going errands for her parents. He offered to accompany her in her farm duties. He acted the cavalier in 100 different ways, and yet no one was more surprised than Alice when the rumour got abroad that she had transferred her affections from Sergeant Deeby to Francis Hardwin. The sergeant went on his daily round of duty as usual. If he had any feelings, he did not let them master him. He took no one into his confidence, and what he thought and felt was locked as a secret in his innermost heart. He heard that Alice Gray had been seen out walking with Mr. Hardwin. He was not overcome by surprise at this news, and the person who had told it to him went away disappointed. He was informed that Alice and Mr. Hardwin were engaged, or at least their bearing towards each other was that of an engaged couple. At hearing this news he actually grinned, and it was even said that he made an abortive attempt to laugh. Truly, Sergeant Deeby had his feelings well under control. At length the church bore witness of Alice's instability. The banns between Francis Hardwin and Alice Gray were duly published, and preparations were being made for their speedy marriage. The ceremony was to take place in an adjoining parish, where a distant relative of the Greys was curate. People said that it was going to be a quiet affair, and that the happy couple were going up once upon a continental honeymoon. Someone told this to Sergeant Deeby. He only smiled, asked if that was quite certain, and then changed the subject of the conversation. The bells rang out right merrily upon the morning of the wedding. The sun shone in all his splendour, making bright the path of the beautiful bride. A crowd of country gossips and inquisitive idlers hung around the doors of the church from an early hour, and the story of the bride's checkered courtship was freely circulated amongst them. At length a murmur of surprise ran through the crowd. Every eye was turned in the direction of the gate, and more than one heart was chilled with unwelcome presentiment as Sergeant Deeby, in plain clothing, with another gentleman, walked up the yard and into the church. There they sought a dark and retired corner, removed from the gaze of the inquisitive members of the crowd. The latter were, however, every now and then to be detected peeping in at the door, anxious to catch a glimpse of the unexpected guests. The bells pealed forth a joyous note as the bride and her party appeared. Alice's unrivalled beauty rather seemed to adorn than be adorned by the tasteful raiment in which she was dressed. Mr. Hardwin looked haughty and proud, and the eyes that fell in admiration upon the bride assumed a look of incisive inquiry as they turned upon the statelier figure of the bridegroom. The ceremony was got through in the usual fashion. If the bride was nervous, it was only what brides usually are. The bridegroom certainly showed no signs of trepidation. To judge by his coolness, as he led his new partner away from the altar, wedding might have been an everyday affair with him. He was even well prepared for the shower of rice that greeted the exit of the party from the church, and throwing a quantity of small silver amongst the youngsters assembled, he nimbly piloted the bride to the carriage that was waiting for them. Mr. Hardwin handed his bride into the vehicle. He had his foot upon the step and was about to enter, when a hand was laid upon his shoulder. "The other carriage, please," said the owner of the hand. Mr. Hardwin looked round. It was Mr. Deeby who had spoken, and Mr. Deeby's finger was indicating a cab that stood in the rear. "No, thanks," smiled Mr. Hardwin. "I'll go in here." "No, just come to the rear one moment," said Mr. Deeby. "No, don't bother me now," said Mr. Hardwin to his rival. "What is it that you want with me?" "I could have told you in private, but here will do as well for me if you prefer it. I arrest you for bigamy, that is, for marrying Alice Gray while your former wife is still alive." Had a cannonball dropped in the coach, Mr. Hardwin could not have changed colour more quickly, but by a powerful effort he regained his composure and affected to believe that the matter was a jest. He told the driver to drive on, and was jumping into the coach when the sergeant pulled him back. "Here's my authority," he said, pulling out a paper. "It's a warrant for deserting your wife, and the charge of bigamy will go on top of that." There was great commotion among the assembled sightseers. Mr. Hardwin swore that it was a case of mistaken identity, and that he would resort to the law for his revenge, but ultimately he was got into the cab and driven off from the presence of the fainting bride. At the assizes, the judge wanted to know why the sergeant had not executed the warrant sooner, and so prevented bigamy. In reply, the sergeant related the story of the tramp from Lincolnshire, and said he meant to be sure of his game this time. Therefore, he contrived a second string to his bow. The prisoner was found guilty. He had a long list of previous convictions against him, and it was some time before he was restored to his wife and family. It may surprise young readers, but it will not surprise older ones, to learn that the fire of love, surviving the deluge of mischance, burned up into a brighter flame. The officer and Alice were ultimately united, and together now enjoy the retirement that follows a life of faithful labour.